Good afternoon, everyone. We are very honored to welcome Professor Marsha Richmond from Wayne State University, Michigan, in celebrating the 30th anniversary of the History, Theory, and Science Teaching Group. Professor Richmond's research deals with heredity, genetics, evolution, cell theory from Darwin through the 1940s, women and gender in early 20th century life sciences, and environmental history. Formerly an editor on the Darwin Correspondence Project in Cambridge, England, she currently serves on Darwin Project Management Board. She is editor-in-chief of the Journal of the History of Biology and immediate past president of the International Society for the History, Philosophy, and Social Studies of Biology. In addition, she is fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She wrote several papers, chapters of books, and books on subjects of her expertise. I met her at the International Meeting of History, Philosophy, and Social Studies of Biology, 1999, in Oaxaca, Mexico. Since then, along with other group members, such as Marilice Prestes, we have had the opportunity to interact with her in several ways. Related to the Brazilian Association for Philosophy and History of Biology, she is part of the editorial board of the Journal Philosophy and History of Biology and participated in the meeting of History and Philosophy of Biology 2014, giving the inaugural conference. Besides that, she has been an international collaborator of the Group of History and Theory of Biology, CNPq, since 2016. Now let us enjoy her presentation, The Imperative for Inclusion, a Gender Analysis of Genetics. Thank you very much, Professor Marsha, for coming.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to, this is a great honor to help you celebrate the 30th anniversary of the group. And so I wanted to try out for you a paper that's just been accepted for the studies in history of philosophy of science. That's going to be published in a special issue called New Directions in the Historiography of Genetics. And what I'm arguing is reasons why to include women in the historiography of genetics in a little bit different way than you may have thought about before. What I'm going to argue is that to look not just at individuals and their participation in science, but to look at gender systematically in doing history of a discipline. This goes back almost 50 years now to a historian, Joan Scott, who argued that gender is both a legitimate and a necessary category of historical analysis. Now, while the history of science was a little bit slow in picking up women in the history of genetics, by the 1980s, and particularly the 1990s, there's been quite a bit of research done. And we now have a robust literature picking up women in the history of genetics. So are you hearing me okay?
Yes, we are, Marsha.
Good. So there's a lot of literature now with talking about the participation of women as individuals, as members of couples, and so forth. And so this is all good, but I'm arguing that that's not enough. What's going on? Already in the 1960s, there were three major texts that appeared in the discipline of genetics. And from the beginning, we have a masculine image of the foundation and development of genetics since around 1900. You can see that these three foundational texts would mention women, but only that. The main focus was on the men. So the genetics, as so many other disciplines, had a masculine image. So in the interim, between the 60s, the feminist turn has provided, as I said, robust literature. But women have, what I'm going to try to argue is that women have played a leading role in genetics that has not sufficiently been recognized. And that we need to focus on women in the social and institutional history of the discipline. And in so doing, we will find that the literature in the discipline of genetics, but I'm going to argue that this just as case study, it's the same for all disciplines in the history of science. Also, I'm saying adding women is not just enough. I mean, it is fantastic to know more about the women who have contributed to science. But there's a broader goal. That is that when we look at science, we need an inclusive history in which gender is fully integrated into the historical analysis and not just marginalized by looking at women as somehow separate from the way the science itself has developed. So this would be approachable by doing what is called gender analysis. And that is in which you integrate gender into the interrogation of the social factors that influence institutional organization, research practices, and knowledge production. And that it's not just applicable to genetics, but genetics is a good case study, as I will go into in just a second. So what I'm going to argue is that women were actively involved in genetics from the 1890s, and the subset of that is that genetics and several other subfields, new experimental areas of science at the time, such as ecology and radiation, radiation studies, and biochemistry. This is the case. Women are there. Why? Because they are getting degrees for the first time, both undergraduate degrees from universities around the world, as well as advanced graduate degrees. In the case of genetics, they made important contributions that helped establish Mendelism as a legitimate discipline by 1910, and then Mendelian genetics by around 1915 as a very exciting revolutionary field in the life sciences. I'm going to argue that they were important staff members and go through that various organizations in which they participated. Then I'm going to say that gender analysis yields some new perspectives that otherwise might elude scholars studying the history of science. And finally, conclude that only by including women in our histories are we able to present both an accurate and a unified historiography of genetics and science more generally. So this is the organization of my talk. So first of all, let me try to convince you that women were present from even before 1900. And I'm going to look at three of the earliest research institutes in genetics. First, starting with William Bateson, then moving to in Britain, then moving to the United States and looking at the Station for Experimental Evolution that was founded at Cold Spring Harbor, New York in 1904, and then on to Erwin Bauer's Institute of Heredity in Berlin, established in 1914. And then I will look at some universities where women were there and private research institutes. So first of all, William Bateson. Now this is to show you that from the 1890s, when Bateson began his work, and Lillian knows this quite well, on the study of variation as a means to explore how evolution occurred, he had no access to other staff members rather than women who were present at Cambridge studying at Newnham College and Girton colleges, the two women's colleges at Cambridge. Now, these were not just any women, these were some of the brightest minds in England at the time. And his right-hand person was Edith Rebecca Saunders, who was head of the Balfour Laboratory for Biology at Cambridge, who taught the women at Newnham and Girton. And she recruited a number of her brightest students to come in and begin Mendelian experiments. So you can see the number of women who were participating in Bateson's school. And let's see if I can remove that. And then they by the 1910s, they had established Mendelism through their individual research projects as a legitimate and very promising field of biology. But Cambridge did not support William Bateson's Mendelian research program. They appointed him as professor of biology, but gave him no money to support experimental research in Mendelism. So when he was offered the prospect of becoming the director of the newly created John Innes Horticultural Institution in 1910, he jumped at the chance. Just like at Cambridge, Bateson invited women onto the staff. Now, this photograph was taken in 1929, 3 years after Bateson died suddenly of a heart attack. And a new director came on board, Sir Daniel Hall, here in the center. But the women that Bateson hired remained at the John Innes Institution until the late 1930s, early 40s. And they were mainstays, as you can see. Many of the men standing behind them were young men who came in and went, but they were there for the longue durée. C.D. Darlington, who Bateson hired in 1924, eventually took over of the cytology lab. Interestingly, in 1938-39, when he became director of the John Innes, he was responsible for forcing Bateson's ladies, as they were called, out of the institution. He forced them to retire. But if you look at his own lab, women were very much a part of his work as well. So women were very much a part of the John Innes Institute. Now, they were also, from the beginning, central to Charles Benedict Davenport's institution at a Station for Experimental Evolution that was founded in 1904 at Cold Spring Harbor, New York, funded by the Carnegie Institution of Washington. Among the first three scientific researchers that Davenport, who's pictured here on the left, hired, one of them was a woman, Anne May Lutz, who was a cytologist. She had a master's degree in botany and cytology from the University of Michigan and had previously worked with Davenport at the University of Chicago, as did these other young men, George Harrison Shull and Frank Luntz, an entomologist. And Lutz is Anne May Lutz, no relationship to Frank Lutz. by 1906, began working on Oenothera, using studying the research organism that Hugo de Vries had established as an organism that seemed to indicate that mutation could occur suddenly, and it would be a species-wide mutation. He was using Oenothera lamarckiana. So Anne May Lutz took this up and began studying the chromosomes. And by 1907, she published a paper that led to her suggestion that these sudden mutations that de Vries had discovered were not actually speciation, but they were due to chromosomal duplications, to triploidy and tetraploidy. And many of you know that this field of work became prominent in botanical genetics and later, as we'll see, in Drosophila genetics. This was a major discovery, and she, E.G. Conklin, called it an epoch-making discovery. So her work was actually very important, but she left the institution. I won't go into this, how she left here, but as did the other two initial research workers by 1915. So a changing of the guard occurred, a second generation came on, and it's not important for you to know anything about Blakesley or Metz, other than we're going to see that this was a changing in the way that scientific work was carried out at Cold Spring Harbor. Both Metz and Blakesley were able to hire assistants. These assistants were not always women, but most of them were. So the top row here, we can see Anna Dorothy Bergner and Sophie Satina became Blakesley's primary assistants. He also hired some other women that worked with his research team. And Metz also hired assistants that regularly helped him. Now, I put Barbara McClintock in here just to notice that there was a changing of the guard around 1940. For the first time since Anne May Lutz left, Barbara McClintock came on as a research associate. So in between the 1915 and around the 1940, the women at Cold Spring Harbor were all assistants rather than research associates. But they all had bachelor's degree from major universities in the United States, and some even began by the 1920s to have PhDs, and yet were still called assistants. So remember that in just a second, because I'm going to make a big deal out of it. Then finally, Erwin Bauer followed suit. Now, interestingly, in Germany, it took longer for women to gain access to a university education. It was really only in the 1890s that they were able to do that, whereas in the UK and the US, it happened from the 1860s. But when women did get access to a university, excuse me, they had full privileges of men. So all of the women that Bauer hired had PhDs, and they did independent research, much the same as the women that were working at the John Innes. But one of the things that you're going to see from the Aaron Bauer's case and the women working with him is, as I'm arguing, that by the 1920s, from basically 1915 on, Women were gradually marginalized in genetics. Once it was recognized as a legitimate field, they continued to be workers in there, but their status was diminished. You can see that most visibly by the case of Elizabeth Schiemann, who was the major woman working under Bauer. She eventually wrote a biography of him, for example. But when Bauer became director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Plant Breeding in 1931, he had promised Schiemann that she would become the director of the Institute for Breeding Research. But that was not the case. They passed her over in favor of a much younger and less institutionally experienced man, Hans Kappert. And rather than accept this indignity, Schiemann resigned. And if you're interested in her case later, I'd be happy to answer some questions about that. So women were there. They were there in the research institutes of genetics. They were doing major work, but they were finally within the organization of the institutes, their position became diminished gradually. Now, women were also present in Drosophila genetics. Although you wouldn't really know it if you looked at the major biographies and works on Morgan's School of Genetics. Bob Kohler in Lords of the Fly called this group the Boss and the Boys. And certainly it is the case. There's no denying the major people who helped publish the Mendelian chromosomal theory of genetics were all males. But until 1915, women were the majority of Morgan's recruits to Drosophila work. And they continued to be very much a part of Drosophila genetics thereafter. Gar Allen gave me this photograph, for example, and in it you see Sturtevant and Franz Schrader and Don Lansfield, who all were major people within the Columbia Fly group. But you also see women. Now, several of these women are spouses, but they're not just spouses. They have PhDs, including Sally Hughes Schrader, Rebecca Lansfield. Phoebe Reed has an undergraduate degree, but she was a technician and then later married Sturtevant and assisted with his work. And Edith Wallace had a master's degree in biology and preferred working with Morgan as his technician rather than teaching at a women's college. So women were there, and you can see Morgan had a number of women students, and he had women who were postdocs in genetics, including Helen Redfield, who had worked under H.J. Muller at Rice and then got a PhD in genetics at University of California, Berkeley. Morgan's wife, Lillian, was trained up. She had a master's degree in embryology and met her husband at Bryn Mawr when he was teaching there. But after their 4 children got into school, she went back into the lab, but switched over to doing genetics rather than embryology, and made a major discovery soon after joining his lab, including the attached X chromosome. So once again, triploidy in Drosophila. And I won't go into why this was important, but it was critical for research work in the 1920s and 30s and on. Now, Mike Dietrich and a graduate student published a paper in JHB called Beyond the Boss and the Boys in 2007, a major paper in which they looked at the numbers of women and men in Drosophila genetics in the US from 1934 through 1970. And as you'll notice here, women do not, they continue to work in genetics, and they track their numbers, track the number of women there, men there. And the other thing that I will show from that is that there was not, the problem was that women had trouble finding jobs in genetics, mainly because at universities, in the United States, there was a practice of not hiring spouses of men because of nepotism. So women who were PhDs and married to men who were geneticists had to find different jobs. As you can see what happened with Anna Rachel Whiting, whose husband, Phineas Whiting, had a job at University of Pittsburgh, but she worked at the Pennsylvania College of Women until 27. But when he transferred to the University of Pennsylvania, she couldn't be hired there. And that's what happened to a number of other women. So as we will see, that it minimized women's formal representation in science. The problem with nepotism, however, did not keep women in Europe from being hired at universities. A good illustration of that is Tina Thomas, who became the first Dutch professor of genetics and the second female professor at a Dutch university. And she too made some major contributions to genetics. Christina Bonavie was appointed a professor of zoology, and her specialty was genetics in 1912, and was the first woman professor in Norway. And she led a major school of genetics in which she trained up men as well as women, as we're going to see in just a moment. And then finally, women could get positions in private research institutes, as did Helen Dean King, who spent her entire career at the Wistar Institution in Philadelphia doing the important work on the genetics of the albino rat. So I'm hoping that I can have convinced you women were there, they were doing major work, but we don't know much about them. And the reason for that, I argue, is because of the new organizational model that came in for the experimental sciences, namely research groups, that you can see most visibly at Cold Spring Harbor. So I mentioned that in 1915, 1914, Davenport hired two new directors for botanical genetics and zoological genetics. And both of these figures were able to hire assistants. But these assistants became kind of the norm, both at in the groups, Morgan's group at Columbia, but at Cold Spring Harbor and other groups. Margaret Rossiter has said that this model for research groups that came in during the late teens and 20s reflected the bureaucratization that was going on in American corporate business organization, in which the men, it became very masculinized at the time that professions were, businesses were becoming more professionalized. Professionalization was by the culture understood as masculine. So while women's work was essential to these research groups, women were essentially rendered invisible because these groups were male dominated. For example, under this new organizational model, these assistants were the right-hand people to do the experiments. But, for example, it was not until 1940s, when Barbara McClintock came on, that these women, despite the fact that several of them had PhDs, were hired as anything more than an assistant. And the other thing that made their work invisible was that the research was often attributed to the director. This was true both under Bateson and Bauer, but particularly at Cold Spring Harbor, where Blakesley's policy was always to be listed as first author, whether or not he participated in the work his assistants did. So even if a woman did all of the research and even the analysis of some of their work, they didn't get full credit for it. And most people and historians as well assume that it was the work of the head of the research group. Now you can see that again in Dietrich and Tabasco's analysis. The top graph here shows the position of the division of labor of men versus women within Drosophila genetics. So most of the men who are carrying out work are faculty members. They are hired at universities. Only a small number are research associates or technical assistants, whereas the women are predominantly technical assistants, and then a few are research associates. And even originally, Barbara McClintock was hired as a research investigator. So this minimalizes the contributions of women. So another facet of my argument is that including women in the history of either genetics or any field in science, it's not just a matter of writing the record. It's not just saying, pointing out women's inequality or exclusion and so forth. I'm arguing that focusing on women provides a special window into revealing social and cultural histories of science that may not be obvious if you just focus on the men in a particular group. They are, for example, particularly important in scientific communication. Women facilitated intra and inter-laboratory social interactions in a variety of ways. Women are passing what we might call gossip in between various groups. They talk to one another, they talk to other men, they pass information back and forth, they network, they form romantic relationships, and this transfers knowledge in between different groups. They have visiting positions at different labs. A number of assistants were highly regarded, and it's very interesting to see the lab director saying, "Oh, I'm really interested in getting this particular woman to come and work for me for a while." So they are traded between labs, and when they go between the institutes, they serve as a mechanism for transferring knowledge and expertise and technical acumen. Very important. And some of the sexual interaction that they have is also something that I think is very important for us to acknowledge. These mixed gender environments are not just neutral, if you will. Here is the tea room at the John Innes, and there's a lot of conversation that goes on when you're sharing food with your colleagues, right? There's a lot of discussion there. And C.D. Darlington, who was noted, particularly noted, as was Bridges in Morgan's laboratory, as a womanizer, he formed sexual trysts with a number of the women, not just at the Innis, but people that he encountered at other institutes as well. And here you see, it's not a very great photograph, but you see Margaret Upcott, who was a PhD student who came to work with him in the early 1930s, and they eventually formed a romantic attachment and were married in 1937. Didn't have a very happy ending. I'm going to skip over that, and because when he eventually divorced her after she gave birth to their fifth child, and her, needless to say, her career in genetics was cut short. Finally, women are very important in the professionalization of genetics at a critical time in the discipline's foundation. They actively participated in science societies and meetings. They gave papers. They served as officers. Let me give you a few examples. This is a picture of the Third International Congress of Genetics that met in Paris in 1911, shortly before the outbreak of the First World War. And the opening plenary by the president of the French Society of Horticulture recognized them specifically, saying that even the ladies have made experimental contributions to the new science and taken active part in our work. In the 1919, Bateson and Saunders formed the British Genetical Society, and this is a picture taken at their first meeting. And you can see the large number of women who were present, many of them who worked with Bateson either at Cambridge or at the John Innes. Then at the very important Fifth International Congress of Genetics in Berlin, women were honorary presidents, Bonnevie and Thomas, and a number of women from the UK and USA presented papers. And I'm going to, this just shows that Becky Saunders became president of the botany section, the first woman to be president of one of the sections of the British Association. And then finally, I want to argue that if you ignore women in your history, there is a price to pay. It can skew one's interpretations. I have a good example to show from a paper that is otherwise very scholarly and lovely. It was a 2014 reappraisal of Bateson's rejection of chromosome theory published by Alan Rushton in the British Journal for the History of Science. And he goes through a definitive treatment. But one thing that he overlooked, and I don't know for certain, but I think that it was probably because he ignored the women who worked for Bateson, was that it was a woman working in his laboratory that eventually converted Bateson to believing in the Mendelian chromosome paradigm. A woman by the name of Aslaug Sverdrup, who had took her PhD under Bonnevie at the University of Oslo, and she was intimately associated. She knew T.H. Morgan's work well and helped Bateson understand it. And you can see this exchange most visibly in some correspondence between C. Clifford Dobell, a protozoologist who had a very poor opinion of the Morgan school. He wrote to Bateson, whom he thought also had attacked the chromosome theory of genetics. He said, "The whole thing is a colossal stunt, one of the biggest bluffs they, the Morgan School, have ever put up, even in America." And Bateson wrote back to him saying, be careful here. When I last visited the Morgan Group at Christmas in 1921, I was convinced that the transferable characters, almost beyond question, are somehow specially attached to the chromosomes. I don't like it, but I see no escape. And he said, like you, I can't read Drosophila papers in more than a superficial way. We have had here for some years Miss Sverdrup, a Norwegian who has it all at her fingers' end. She expounds it to us, and I have come to see that there is no discovery about it. And for me, this was precious because now I can point this out in my book on women in the history of genetics to Rushton's annoyance, I'm sure. So let me conclude quickly. Science and power are intimately associated. Paul Starr, a noted sociologist of science, said that like medicine, science is built on specialized knowledge, but it's also a social endeavor. So you have to understand that science is associated with power. Some people stand above others in knowledge and authority. As I've shown you in science, that happen to be men. But as Joan Scott, as I pointed out in my first slide, said, gender is a constitutive element of social relationships. It's based on perceived differences between the sexes, and it's a primary way of signifying relationships of power. Well, I think that part of the problem in historiography is that we, like much of the general public, we historians, hold a Nobel Prize view of science. Stephen Shapin, for example, has noted that credit in science is assessed on the basis of judging whether an individual is knowledgeable or only a skilled agent. And as we are seeing that now that the Nobel Prizes are coming out this week, it's these people that believe that it is scientific genius, right? In which only a few individuals are rewarded with recognition. And this perpetuates the view is the solitary pursuit of great minds, geniuses, not work that's performed collaboratively. But even in the awarding of the prizes this week, these women are in the groups that these men who got the prizes are directing. Now, women lose out in the Nobel conception of science. As Naomi Oreskes points out, women's primary participation in research groups and their job descriptions as assistants and so forth, no matter what their actual contributions were, serves to render them invisible. So it takes the sociology of science and of gender to recognize that within the organizational structure of 20th century science, women lost their early hegemony and autonomy by virtue of being marginalized within a hierarchical organization of work. So if you look at gender, to understand the different labor market opportunities for men and women, you must know something about the form of organizations in which they work. So, as brilliant as Barbara McClintock was, she stood on the shoulder not just of men in genetics, but of women who had gone before her. So finally, the imperative for inclusion is not simply to write the record, but to provide a more accurate historical account, using gender instrumentally to uncover aspects of social organization and knowledge production that otherwise would remain hidden. So I urge you to follow the women, because it will provide you with insights that might otherwise be overlooked, valuable information about the organization of research and methodologies and techniques used, and institutional functioning, along with professional development, and just some very interesting, curious scientific gossip that might be important. So fully integrating women into the history of genetics and other sciences goes far beyond merely acknowledging their presence. Much more is involved and much more is at stake, because only when the imperative for inclusion is fully embraced by historians will a more accurate and insightful historiography emerge for genetics and other disciplines. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and hopefully rejoin the group.
Yeah, I will open my mic and everything, so we have some applauses for you, Marsha. Thank you so much for your presentation. Lillian, do you want to say a few words? I can make the questions, but if you want to have your own words first, please do it.
No, I'd like to thank Marsha very much for her presentation. I enjoyed it very much, but I leave the questions to you, okay? So you can go.
Okay. So we have questions from the YouTube and from here, the Google meeting. Well, just to clarify for people in YouTube, we have all members of the GHTC, the Historian of Science, Theory and History meeting. We are here in Google Meet. So we have two questions here. Well, one is from Lillian. Don't you want to read it, Lillian?
Let me try. Marsha, thank you very much for your presentation. Through the analysis of Bateson's correspondences, when I was studying him, I felt that he had a particular way of dealing with women, not only with his sisters, such as Anna, who was a botanist and also married, but also with the ones who worked with him, such as Caroline Pilleu. It looked like that professionally he dealt with them in the same way as he dealt with the men. How can I say? Some reports of the Evolution Committee have the full names of the women who worked with him as the first authors, such as Edith Saunders, for example. So, for me at least, it looked like that Bateson's way of dealing with his women collaborators was more inclusive than Morgan's one. Departing from your research, comparing Bateson's attitude to the other group's leaders, what is your view?
I think you're right, Lillian. Bateson was early on a feminist. He had very brilliant sisters, as you mentioned, Anna and Mary. His wife, his mother was also quite a dynamic woman, and I think he respected the minds of women, and he had no trouble working with women. And I think that at the John Innes, he felt comfortable with working with women, but he nonetheless the women at the Innes, when he was directing the work there, he assigned them the problem to work on. They would carry it out on their own, but he was kind of giving them the problem to do, and they got to publish under their own work and so forth. But he was designing the research program. The same thing was at Davenport didn't design the research program per se, but Aaron Bauer did. So the women were constrained just a little bit. With Morgan, he directed people's dissertations and so forth, but he never included the women in the inner circle. The women that I said were part of Morgan's group were part of the extended Drosophila group, and but that was, you hate to say it, but I mean that's kind of that's the point of the masculine image. Women weren't supposed to be. They could not be heads at university. They weren't appointed at universities in the United States really until the 1930s and 1940s. If you'll recall, Barbara McClintock left the University of Missouri to go to Cold Spring Harbor. She wasn't clear whether she would get tenure with only female at this university. So the atmosphere, I think Erwin Bauer is not a feminist, and so he treated women differently. So there is something that about that, but the women all needed mentors one way or the other. They had to kind of work through the men, particularly early on when they were excluded from the scientific societies. Those women at the Cold Spring Harbor would have had trouble getting employed at universities if they weren't working at these research institutes. So I guess what I'm arguing is that it's a double-edged sword. Women were given the opportunity to work. They got on with it, whether they felt that they were discriminated against or not, because they loved science and they wanted to work in science. But they were marginalized through the organization. And so it depended on a lot of social factors of the men that they were associated with as to whether their work was promoted or not.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Marsha.
Marsha, I'm going to read a comment from the YouTube. That's from Roberto de Andrade Martins. He says, "Dear Professor Marsha Richmond, thank you very much for your wonderful talk. I've learned a lot and I enjoyed it very much."
Thank you.
And now I'm going to read, because I put a question here, so I will read, that is easier now. That is related with what you are talking about, but from the side of the women. When women started to be major part of the faculty members, can it be observed that the female contractors had to develop a male attitude to be really heard in committees, fund divisions, etc.? I ask you to comment on this because at my institute, at USP, today it is possible to observe some older women generation who have an authoritarian and austere performance, while younger women who can be themselves with those characteristics you mentioned in one of your slides, especially flexibility and listening. So what do you think about that?
I think that's absolutely right. And that's something that I think gender analysis can get at, that just focusing on individuals doesn't allow you to do. Because gender analysis allows a systematic and institutional approach. It also, and I didn't mention this at all, it allows you to focus on generational cohorts. And that's the point that you're saying. It's the same at my institution. I'm getting ready to retire, and there's some new young women professors in my department, and they have a totally different demeanor than I assumed, right? I would go in every day to class. I would never go in anything that was casual, but some of my colleagues will wear jeans, right? It's there are gendered norms in society, and the women follow them. I think as well as men do. So some of the earliest women, as the question was pointing out, they had to adopt a masculinized kind of way of demeanor, sometimes a way of dress. Edith Rebecca Saunders always had a white shirt and a black tie and a black skirt, looking very masculine, I think, just to fit in. So that's another aspect of, I think you can read, I read a lot of photographs. You can tell demeanor, right? And so I think if you use gender analysis, it helps you to comprehend factors that don't come out in just archival records.
Yes, sure. Thank you. I will read you a question from YouTube now. Sibeli added that this male style is still quite present in physics institute, I think, yeah. And Sarah Ortman, Professor Marsha, thank you for the enlightening presentation. What was it that made possible for women to be so present in genetics research in the early 20th century before groups policies?
Yeah, the reason that I am focusing, and Ida Stamhouse and I are working on a book. We're in the final stages of trying to get the manuscript put together. One of the things that makes genetics such a great case study is that, if you'll recall, Mendel came out in 1900. And 1900 was just the point where the second and third generation of women were graduating from university. And unlike the second generation that were just happy to have, studied science, these women wanted to work in science. So having jobs open to them in these new research institutes gave them the opportunity to work in genetics. And so when they were excluded from university positions in the US and the UK, these allowed job opportunities. So it's very much, these women, they're university graduates, and they're graduates of some of the leading institutions in the world: Cambridge, Oxford, the Seven Sisters women's colleges in the United States, and so forth. So I think it's that combination. Genetics and biochemistry, if you look at biochemistry, it's the same pattern. Women were there from early on because they needed a workforce, and these women were available and eager to participate, and they were quite capable of doing so.
I see.
Radiation genetics is not genetics, but as Maria Rentezzi has shown, that women were very much, it wasn't just Madame Curie, right?
Sure, thanks. So now I have here Marilia Salles de Siqueira, but I think it is Luis Carlos, right? Would you like to make your question, Luis Carlos?
Yeah, I think that I wrote my question, but there is some problem that I would have to take the other part of the question in the other portion. Actually, it's the question related to the beginning of the presentation of Professor Marsha. First of all, thank you very much for your excellent and very interesting presentation. I'm not a historian specialized in history of genetics, but in the beginning of your presentation, I think maybe in the first mention that you had made about the delay of history of science to be concerned with women in relation to the other fields of history, such as history of economic history, political history, social history, etc., etc., etc. And I'd like to ask you if the possibility of this delay could be related to the interest of those fields of history in terms of a direct preoccupation with the women struggles in the 60s and the 70s. I mean, the emergence of the feminist movement in the Western
Right. I'm not completely sure that I understand all facets of your question, but you're absolutely right that introducing women into the historiography of science is affiliated, it's associated with the women's movement, right? And but I think it's gone through a phase. And if you look at the philosophers of science, the feminist philosophers of science, you know, they've asked some very interesting questions. You know, is science gendered? And is there a feminist way of doing science? They've raised some important questions, and I think it's important to not ignore the arguments that these women are making. I don't incorporate that too much into my work, but I am trying to draw attention to even the sociologists of science haven't factored gender in enough. So I think it's a good time. When I had an invitation to contribute to this special issue, I'm the only one who looks at women in any way in it, right? So I thought, gosh, I've worked in this area now for 20 years, and I'm going to make some conclusions and kind of say, this is what my career has kind of come to. I think that there are good reasons that are not just looking at, adding women to the picture, that the picture itself of science is gendered. We just don't recognize it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Luis Carlos, for being here with us today also. And now I have a question from Sibeli. Sibeli, do you want to make it, or I read it from the chat?
You can read it.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation, Professor Marsha. What do you think about the roles played by the Nobel Prize for the History of Science and public view of science, mostly to clarifying the collective work of scientists and research groups? I could also add the political role of Nobel Prize, not only the prize for peace, but also for sciences and medicine.
Yeah. I don't know if you, Sibella, if you follow the work of Penina Abraham. Have you ever run across Penina?
No, not yet.
I can, if you're interested, I can send her. She published an article in, it's not Science. I'd have to look up recently, in which she claims that she has a very similar approach, that women have been marginalized, even postdocs now, right? That if you look at the discovery, for example, of RNA restriction enzymes, and that some of the fundamental work that went into the Nobel Prizes that these men got were done by women in their lab, right? And I had the same, I've looked at that a little bit, even though my work is on early genetics, classical genetics. I've done a little bit of some modern, because I'm following generational cohorts. So if you look at Barbara McClintock, I mean, she gets the Nobel Prize, but it's the individual genius that they're kind of looking at, that she's But and for her case, that's probably, you know, a little bit accurate. But if you look at some of the others, I think that we're perpetuating the notion, as I said, that science is not a group activity by the Nobel Prizes. Not that I don't enjoy seeing them. And what, it was last year or 2 years ago that the two women, Dowda, and I can't remember, I'm sorry, the other woman. I've just gotten the new book, you know, that I'm supposed to be reading, but I've been doing too much traveling around Spain and now Portugal recent. But, you know, even Dowda said that when she was trying to study biology in high school, that she was told that women didn't do that, girls didn't do that. So it's going back to your question, Carlos, that women are still today told that science is masculine. So I do think that historians have been influenced by this as well. So I know people try and they will say, oh yeah, there was a woman in this group and so forth, but they still focus on the males, right? The geniuses. I just don't think that's the way science occurs.
Could you please write Panina's name?
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I'll find the citation to the paper that she got into kind of an uproar because she had wanted the illustration of these 6 women that she went into their contributions to be on the cover, and yet they weren't. They were marginalized, right? So Panina is kind of a fierce feminist, and so she made a big ruckus out of that.
Sure, she is.
Thank you.
I will share. I have some of Panina's works with me, so I will share with the group later.
Okay.
And now I'm going to read someone from YouTube. That is Sarah Ortman. No, sorry. It's Lisbeth Lorena Alvarado Guzman. Professor Marsha, thank you very much for the interesting reflections that your seminar brought. It's just a comment. And I will call José Guilherme Lício, that is here in Google Meet with us. He is our recent PhD fellow. Yes, Lício. So please do your question.
Almost there. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Marsha, for your presentation. My question concerns Nobel Prizes too. It seems that in recent years, women have been awarded more frequently than in the past. Do you think this is just a coincidence, or can it be that gender questions are being taken more seriously by traditional scientific communities, such as the Nobel Committee? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's your guess and my guess. Because we don't know too much about what goes on behind the closed doors. But I think, because there was a big to-do, and Douglas may know more about this too. But with the selection of Dowda, and I wish that I knew it escapes me that the other woman that shared the Nobel Prize with her for CRISPR, the discovery of CRISPR, that was controversial, right? Because there were other men whose names were put forward as perhaps deserving the Nobel Prize. So whether they got it, these 2 women got it because of gender, I'm not sure. But either way, there would be some who said, well, they're not deserving. And others would say, but they really did this work, I do think that light has been shown, but still to this day, even I think I did an analysis for the paper, something like only 3% of Nobel Prizes have gone to women. So maybe we're writing the record of recent, but there's still a lot lot of women who have been passed over, and particularly wives. Sometimes the wives and the assistants. When I looked at 3 Nobel Prize winners that shared the prize for physiology and medicine for the restriction enzymes, I found one of them recognized his female research assistants in his Nobel lecture. So that was something. But there were major women in the other 2 Nobel laureates' labs that went missing. They weren't even, even though in the citations of papers, their names were present, but they didn't get a mention in the lecture. Well, I just think, society still thinks of science just like the Catholic Church thinks of priests. So that's a little controversial, I think, to say. But it's Bob Nye, if you look at the Osiris issue on masculinities in science, that's 2 or 3 years old now. He's done great work saying that science, basically drew upon that male code of honor that goes back to the Middle Ages, and I think it's still with us. Try as we might to say we don't look at gender as a factor.
Thank you, Marsha. I'm going back to Luis Carlos Soares. I can read, or do you want to make your question?
No. I have just made my question. No.
I think it's Pablo's turn.
No, yes, but I just read here the another comment. So sorry. Okay,
Actually,
it was the same.
It was the same question, because when I wrote for the first time, the post became only with the half of the phrase that I wrote, and I complemented it after. So
Okay.
For me, it's okay.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for that. So it's really Pablo. It's your turn.
Okay. Hi, Marsha. Wonderful to see you.
Hi, Pablo. It's good to see you too.
And I have thank you for your talk, and I have 2 questions actually. One of them is related to Elizabeth Widmer, the wife, Carl Corren's wife. Yes?
Yeah.
And even when she worked on a pre-Mendelian genetics era, I'd like to know if you can tell us something about her.
And this is Carl Corren's wife?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm afraid she's a woman who has escaped me, Pablo.
Okay.
And that would be interesting to find out, because in the book we mainly have focused on Bauer as the a case study, but
Yes.
Correns, of course, was the director of the first the Kaiser Wilhelm.
Yeah.
Yeah, Institute. And so I don't know about her. I'll have to do some research on her. Richard Goldschmidt, of course, was another person, but he always relied on women assistants. But it's interesting because the assistants in Germany got more. They were more professionalized technical assistants. So they frequently had PhDs, and so they got more recognition, I think, than the assistants did at Cold Spring Harbor, for example. The Americans did. But often the wives of, even Bateson's wife, she didn't have a university education, but she was very bright, and her sister did have and published a lot in genetics. the women who are married to some of these men, they just get subsumed into their work until I have discovered the 1920s, and then they begin to, even if they are only employed, they only are working in their husband's laboratory because they can't be employed by the same university. They're doing graduates. They're working with graduate students. They are recognized frequently. They are the advisors of visiting professors or assist. They're there, and they're very much. I recently did in the paper that I presented at the Sao Paulo that wonderful conference in 2017. Was it 2017?
Yes.
Yeah.
17.
Everything seems so far away now with COVID,
Yeah.
But Sally Hughes Schrader was the same kind of thing, that she did absolutely wonderful work, but her husband was the one who had the professorship at Columbia. So, but she didn't care. She just got on and published her papers and her work because she wanted to do science. And so I don't think the women, I think they pretty much, she was a feminist, but she didn't make a ruckus about it. She just did good science.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry, I don't know anything about Corinth's wife.
Thank you.
And
Pablo, I'm sorry. I will
okay.
have to finish
Yes,
here
of course.
because just now I realized that we are in 1522. So, and we have Douglas Allchin to make his presentation. So I'm sorry, but you can talk with Marsha from here from the chat. And I call Breno to make the next presentation. Thank you, Marsha, so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, thank
and
you.
I'm sorry, Douglas, I may have to leave your presentation a little bit early because it's getting to my dinner time, but I'm going to stay for at least as long as I can.
Just one more. Thank you, Marsha. We know that you are in the middle of a travel in Europe, and so thank you for your kindness to be with us.
Sure.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, so we're going to move on. Before I introduce Professor Douglas Allchin, I will make a quick announcement in Portuguese, só para avisar todos os que estão vendo aqui na sala do Meet ou no YouTube, que na segunda-feira nós vamos ter mais 2 seminários, como parte aqui dos ciclos. Um dos seminários, inclusive, é o do professor Luiz Carlos Soares, que está aqui com a gente, né? Então, dia 11 de outubro, segunda-feira. E também a professora Olímpia Lombardi. Os dois vão oferecer os seus seminários no dia 11, segunda-feira, às 14 horas, ok? Bom, então, agora, voltando à chavinha do inglês. So I'm very happy to introduce Professor Douglas Allchin, a good friend, and I'll read here some of his, a part of his biography. So Douglas Allchin has a Master of Science in Evolutionary Biology and a PhD in History and Philosophy of Science, both from University of Chicago. His research focuses on error and disagreement in science and on episodes in the history of science, primarily from 20th century biology. Allchin began teaching high school biology in 1981 and has continued to teach biology and help integrate HPSS into science and education, history as a tool in science and education. He is co-author of the 1996 collection of historical case studies and historical case studies called Doing Biology, and he's also author of this book that I have here, Teaching the Nature of Science. It was published in 2013. So he continues to write a column for American Biology Teacher, Sacred Bovines, now collected in a volume of the same name. Douglas has developed a special relationship with Brazil. He He first gave an invited presentation to ABFIBI in 2012 on the naturalizing error in biology, then returned to teach at the University of São Paulo for one term in 2015. He also offered a workshop at my university, the Federal University of ABC. So it's my pleasure to have you here, Douglas. It's with you.
Well, it is so wonderful to see everyone gathered here and to feel a part of this community. It has been a special pleasure to interact with everyone in Brazil. So I am honored and pleased to be part of this anniversary celebration. And for that occasion, which always invites this reflective mood about who we are, why we are here, what we are doing, I would like to continue with Marsha's theme that was very focused on not just history, but historiography, how we write history, and go perhaps even one layer deeper to talk about the nature of history of science as a profession and what that means with respect to our aims and our objectives. So, as historians, I want to say, we are all we all enjoy doing history for its own sake. And here you can see me being guilty of this great indulgence, sharing my research with other historians. But we might also ask ourselves, who else really cares? And if we adopt a well-known perspective from the history of science, namely patronage, we might ask, who pays for it? And I suggest that one prime way that we prove ourselves worthy of our very comfortable academic positions is to contribute to science education through history of science. Historians can help everyone appreciate the cultural value of science, as well as the processes that justify the claims that are relevant to social policy and personal decision-making that involve science. So from my perspective, history of science and education about the nature of science are natural partners. And I think this is also very central to why we do history of science at all, to clarify how science works at all levels and in multiple contexts, to inform our understanding of scientific practices today. So I'm going to suggest that members of the public, not our fellow scholars, are our ultimate audience, and that is why we do what we do. And I want to give a sample of how this might be imagined in practice by looking at a particular historical case, situating it in an educational context in a way that allows the history to address a contemporary theme. I am going to guess that most of you are familiar with the story of Mary Wortley Montagu and smallpox variolation. And here I want to show how it might be adapted in an educational context for modern ears. So here is how we might situate ourselves, you being our science students, and as a teacher, inviting our students to engage on a nice historical adventure. So here we are. I'm going to invite you back to the year 1717 to the city of Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, Turkey. Here we are at the heart of the Ottoman Empire. Now, at this time, the wife of the newly arrived British ambassador, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, is encountering the native women, and she greatly admires their pristine complexions. Now, she has this awareness based on her own experience. So just over a year earlier, she contracted smallpox, a disease that had swept through England and left 1 in 5 of its disease patients dead. Now, while Lady Mary survived, the disease had left her face pockmarked. Now, for an elite woman in the 18th century, beauty was an utmost treasure, integral to her social stature and her regard among men. And here you see Lady Mary envisioned in a later painting rejecting the advances of Alexander Pope, the famous poet. Alas, as a result of her disfigurement, Lady Mary had become accustomed to masking her face in public. Yet, when she arrived in Turkey, the women at the baths seemed uniformly unblemished. How had they all apparently escaped the ravaging effects of smallpox, so devastating across the continent? Well, Lady Mary learns that they rely on a medical procedure largely unrecognized in Western Europe: variolation. And she describes it in a letter to her friend. And here she is in her very Turkish garb, her Turkish mode. So I read from her letter. Apropos of distempers, I am going to tell you a thing that will make you wish yourself here. The smallpox, so fatal and so general amongst us, is here entirely harmless by the invention of engrafting, which is the term they give it. There is a set of old women who make it their business to perform the operation every autumn in the month of September, when the great heat is abated. People send to one another to know if any of their family has a mind to have the smallpox. And they make parties for this purpose. And when they are met, commonly 15 or 16 together, the old woman comes with a nutshell full of the matter of the best sort of smallpox, that is, fluid from a pustule, and asks what vein you please to have opened. She immediately rips open that you offer her with a large needle, which gives you no more pain than a common scratch, and puts into that vein as much matter as can lie on the head of her needle, and after that binds up the little wound with a hollow bit of shell, and in this manner opens 4 or 5 veins. The children, or young patients, play together all the rest of the day and are in perfect health to the 8th. Then the fever begins to seize them, and they keep their beds for 2 days, seldom 3. They have very rarely about 20 or 30 pocks on their face, which never mark, and in 8 days' time, they are as well as before their illness. Where they are wounded, there remains running sores during the distemper, which I don't doubt is a great relief to it. every year, thousands undergo this operation, and the French ambassador says pleasantly that they take to undergo the smallpox here by way of diversion as they take the waters in other countries. There is no example of anyone that has died in it. Well, nowadays, of course, we recognize this as induced immunization. Namely, variolation is an early form of vaccination using very natural resources. Well, Lady Mary had already lost her brother to smallpox in 1713. And here in Turkey, she is now concerned about protecting her own son, almost age 5. But is the procedure safe and effective? What are the risks? Using this historical perspective, we have created a problem which we can now invite students to join in. Asking, for example, placed in this position, what will guide your reasoning? How will you assess the credibility of the local Turkish practice? What evidence is sufficient to warrant action? And then this opens an opportunity for student discussion, whether in small groups or as a class as a whole. Well, in this discussion, one may begin to appreciate the many factors that contribute to assessing the scientific merit of a claim. Empirical evidence is surely important, but what counts as evidence, or sufficient evidence, or adequate documentation of results over many years, or perhaps even generations of the collective experience of the Turkish? The Turks there report no deaths, but who can be trusted to speak for the evidence? For a Christian, such as Lady Mary, should the testimony of a non-Christian be trusted unquestionably, or even possibly discounted? The engrafting is not even performed by professional physicians. So who is an expert and why? How does one measure their expertise? How does one establish relevant trust? What would justify a final decision? So there is plenty there for the students to talk about. And when they've had an opportunity to resolve the issue to their own satisfaction, we can return to the story and find out what Lady Mary herself did. Well, in this case, she deemed the evidence acceptable, primarily because of the low incidence of smallpox among all the Turks. She had her son variolated, although it was by an English physician who had accompanied them on their journey to Turkey. We know now that this procedure is effective, but one may wonder if perhaps Lady Mary was unduly biased by her own fears at the time. Was it appropriate for her to extend trust to non-physicians as experts in this case, or to trust anecdotal rather than systematically collected or quantitative evidence? Issues that become important later in the story. Well, 2 years later, Lady Mary returns to England, and she tries to share her experience with others. She becomes an advocate for variolation, although when she does so, she often publishes under a pseudonym. In 1721, another epidemic of smallpox spreads through London, and Lady Mary decides now to have her 4-year-old daughter inoculated. But the physician who had early inoculated her son, Charles Maitland, is now quite reluctant. He fears for his reputation. While variolation had been reported to the Royal Society by foreign correspondents in 1713 and 1716, the procedure has not yet been accepted by the medical establishment. And so ultimately, the event is witnessed by 3 other members of the Royal College of Physicians, including its president, Hans Sloane, the very doctor who had tended Lady Mary during her own bout of smallpox in 1716. And once again, the variolation procedure proves effective. Lady Mary continues her promotion of variolation, and she encourages Caroline, the Princess of Wales, to have her children inoculated. Now, here, the significance of the decision is greatly amplified. Any decision regarding the royal family needs to be approved by the king. And here we have another occasion to invite students to reflect on the case in a historical perspective. As a member of the royal family in 1721, what will you do and why? Well, some persons are persuaded by the successful demonstration of Lady Mary's daughter, additional evidence that wasn't present earlier. For example, one of the physicians who had witnessed the inoculation soon had his own children inoculated. Others, however, are skeptical. Despite Lady Mary's status in British society, many regard the procedure as foreign, a practice of a less civilized culture, and thus inherently untrustworthy. Well, what is the evidence? Without reputable medical journals, easily accessible via the internet, what would even constitute a reliable report of the relevant evidence? Is one case performed in England sufficient? Well, whose testimony, based on what expertise, matters? Despite her enthusiasm, Lady Mary is certainly not a trained physician. And the physicians who witnessed the one recent case, well, have they developed enough experience to vouch for the procedure? In this new context, under these slightly different circumstances, what are the appropriate criteria for establishing credible claims for guiding judgments? And here again, we allow the opportunity for students to have their discussion. Well, when we return to the story, we find that Princess Caroline is indeed favorably disposed to the prospect, but the king less so. He is ultimately persuaded, however, to approve a formal experiment. They enlist Hans Sloane, who is also a physician to the royal family, to test prisoners from the notorious Newgate prison. 6 individuals scheduled for executions are offered the opportunity to volunteer to participate in a trial inoculation. They are compared with another prisoner who has already survived smallpox. In addition, one prisoner, a female, is exposed to a contagious smallpox patient afterwards to ensure that the procedure is not only safe, but also effective. And for a greater assurance on the safety with young children, Caroline has a handful of orphans from the local parish inoculated, in this case, without their consent. Well, the ethics of the testing notwithstanding, the results indicate that, as before, the procedure is safe, and the prisoners are freed. Ultimately, the king grants permission for inoculating Caroline's daughters, but not the sons. Perhaps that is just too risky for the royal lineage. Well, the controversy continues. Many of society's elites who have lost family members or friends to smallpox enroll their children. Dr. Maitland, who has performed the procedure throughout, publishes a small booklet on the virtues of variolation. And other volumes soon follow, condemning Maitland and inoculation. For example, William Wagstaff, a physician at the distinguished St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, declares, "Prosperity will scarcely be brought to believe that a method practiced only by a few ignorant women, amongst an illiterate and unthinking people, should, on so sudden and upon slender experience, so far obtain in one of the most learned and polite nations in the world, as to be received into the royal palace." Well, for some then, gender and culture seem to shape the interpretation of the evidence. Others contend that the procedure violates God's intentions, so religious perspectives are at work. Again, the question arises for students to address explicitly. What constitutes sufficient evidence scientifically? Do the results from the Newgate prison experiment alter the balance? In what ways might a scientific view differ from an individual perspective based on psychological, social, or cultural factors? And in this reflection, the students might begin to understand what it means to respect or accept scientific conclusions and how they might be biased through personal filters. And that becomes important as the history continues to play out. By 1730, fewer than 900 individuals in England have been inoculated. Smallpox epidemics reappear in 1731, 1734, and 1736, and again with exceptional virulence in 1752. Tens of thousands of people die. The Royal College of Physicians finally endorses inoculation in 1754, but death rates do not decline significantly until well into the next century. Skepticism about inoculation, or vaccines, it seems, has a long and complex and apparently fascinating history. Well, having completed our historical episode, we can reflect on what we've learned through the experience of Lady Mary Wortley and smallpox variolation. And it invites us to reflect on what guides our judgments about scientific claims and what factors actually do shape those judgments for better or worse in comparison with perhaps an ideal. So we might ask, how might the story of the skeptics of 1721 inform our understanding of the public reception or of our own views of vaccines today, a controversy which is sweeping through Brazil as much as it is here in the United States? So here I hope to have offered a way to address a contemporary theme of social policy by taking us back into a historical case study which engages students in thinking through those issues in another context. And in that sense, the role of questioning, of posing problems to students, using the history to contextualize the discussion, but allowing the students to complete that inquiry on their own, is really critical. And that is a solution of sorts, or a strategy that I want to suggest and promote on the occasion of this anniversary gathering. And as I hope we will have a little moment for comments and questions, but before we get there, I'm going to invite everyone who's here listening to reflect on their own scholarship, their own research, and to think if there are any ways in which all that good scholarly work might be transformed into a case study that could be used in a science classroom to help bring the features of science, its reliability, its cultural context, more vividly to issues that are relevant today, using a way of jumping forward from the past to the present. That's certainly what I have been doing in a lot of my work and in teaching a course at USP several years ago. And I hope that throughout Brazil, the method can be embraced more fully and mark this group, which is already committed to history of science and education. And with that, I will close my presentation and invite comments and questions. I think, there we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Douglas. Thank you for your very interesting talk. So I will open to questions. I'll ask Maria Alice or Sibeli to read the questions at the chat, because if I open the chat here, it will appear in the transmission and in the streaming.
That's true.
So if you could read, if you have, I saw that some questions popped. So if you could.
Since the question in our Google Meet chat is mine, I'm going to read it just to be quicker because. Okay, thank you, Douglas, for this wonderful historical case study to teach science and nature of science. If I've followed reasonably well the North American newspapers, which report the resistance against the COVID vaccine, not only among Trumpian Republicans, but also among Latinos and African Americans. I read also that in these last two groups, resistance has subsided a little bit in this last month. I hope so, that is true. But taking this scenario, thinking about them, especially in relation to African Americans, historical case approached with this, with your investigative modality, wouldn't it also contribute to overcoming the, fear the African American have of being taken as guinea pigs for white science? Since we know that in the beginning of the century, this happened not only in the United States, I think, but in other places of the world. So do you think that taking cases, involving them, and bringing this historical shame ethics in medical research could help? Or do you think it's better to don't talk about this and just try to find another kind of arguments to this community to have the vaccination? I don't know if that was clear.
I am one of these advocates for transparent history and really understanding the full breadth of history. The case of, for example, the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, and they are not unique because there was similar research done on syphilis with American physicians in Central America with indigent patients. And of course, we can cite examples of Japanese doing research in China. It's not exclusive among American whites, allows us at least to acknowledge that such forces work historically as they might today. But then in talking about it, it opens up discussion about what is the evidence for those processes occurring. Do we have any evidence for them occurring today? And that can then open up discussion of like, well, are we just asking Blacks and Latinos to get the vaccines while the whites and the elites wait to see if it works? Well, in this case, that argument doesn't really hold very well because most of the educated people who really trust science were the first ones to jump onto the vaccine bandwagon. But again, history can be a window or a lens for opening up discussion of those issues and then for working through and discussing them, I think. But the key factor, I think, is in engaging the students and not just lecturing at them.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Douglas.
Thank you, Maria Alicia. I'm going to read, there is a comment and a question on the YouTube chat. So a comment from Sarah Ortman. Such a wonderful opportunity as someone entering the HBS and teaching research field to get to know Professor Allchin in person, beyond the papers. Thank you. And Roberto de Andrade Martins ask you a question. Thank you very much for your wonderful talk, Douglas. I have a question. After all, variolation was not completely safe, and it was replaced by vaccination. Many people refuse to accept variolation by wrong reasons, but people who advised variolation couldn't provide evidence that the procedure was safe. So, how can students discuss the issue since the evidence was incomplete? This is from Roberto.
So, Roberto, always the person to challenge the heart of the matter. My presentation here was very brief. I acknowledge that. And in a classroom, the teacher has the opportunity to expand the case study, perhaps allowing students to do more historical research or for the teacher to include more historical information. I hope that even in my short presentation, I was able to highlight that the problem of incomplete evidence and uncertainty is an issue. And there was another study subsequent to the period that I talked about where they began to do quantitative work on deaths by variolation versus deaths by smallpox, showing the great disparity. But even so, there was a significant death by variolation, in part because of the methods that they used. So the objective, I think, is not to dictate a particular outcome for the students, but to get them to reflect on what the nature of the evidence was, what the long-term outcome was, and how various perspectives like gender or culture or class might have influenced their decisions, allowing us to reflect on whether or not we succumb to those same kinds of factors today, and whether we can tease those apart, those filters, and get at a more enduring, perhaps reliable scientific view unencumbered by those perspectives. If we see that in the long run, those were the ones that were really enduring. And even today, it's not easy to determine who the experts are or whose testimony you should believe. But those are the questions that we need to pose if we expect to provide, in this case, for public health by vaccinating the general public. So no black and white answers, but hopefully occasions to acknowledge the gray and to invite students to delve deeper.
Okay, thank you, Douglas. Okay, Sibeli just raised the hand. I was just going to ask if anybody has a question. Sibeli.
Hi, Douglas. Thanks for your talk. I have more a comment than I have an idea that I would like to see your comment on. Okay. I used the smallpox case with my students several times. Not your smallpox, but anyway, not your case, but the smallpox episode. And the students really like it because you can discuss several issues, not only regarding scientific content itself, but also about context, about power, about how scientific ideas are accepted, and so on. So in the case of COVID, which is our current issue, in Brazil, we have a strong culture of vaccination, in a tradition pro-vaccination. I think we have one of the strongest vaccination system in the world. So this morning I was talking to my husband, and we just realized we were searching on the internet, and we find out that the average of fully vaccinated population in Brazil is 45%, while in the world population it's 35%. So, and we also found research showing that Brazilians, 89% of Brazilians want to be vaccinated. So we have this desire of being vaccinated, which is different from Europe or even United States. But I think it's due to a culture of vaccination that was built along several years. Then I think, so even though we have this culture of vaccination, I think it's important to discuss the problem of incomplete evidences, as you mentioned. I think it is an issue. How we accept scientific results, even what I mean as general public. How general public accept scientific results, or even in the case of the COVID vaccination, when we started being vaccinated, the process was not fully understood, and we had different vaccines, so it was an issue. And I wonder, this is why I would like you to comment, how do you think that historical cases can elucidate all these political issues involved, how we accept healthy results as COVID vaccination, even though we don't have a complete understanding of the whole process. So how could we use historical cases in this kind of unclear situation, as COVID was in the very beginning of the vaccination process?
So, as historians, I think we want to be wary of Whiggish recent history and suggesting that from the very outset, the COVID vaccines were safe and should have been safe and should have been accepted at the very beginning. So I think you're acknowledging that there were uncertainties and that may have left room for different trajectories or different kinds of decisions. And I hope that even in this short presentation about Lady Mary Wortley, you see some of those uncertainties and the tensions about who has expertise. And that through that episode or many other episodes over the course of many years in science education, students come to understand the important role of consensus among the relevant experts. And that might be a benchmark that we use, like if indeed the experts disagree, then the scientific evidence may be ambiguous. But we also need to guard against reports of what the scientific consensus is. So it is customary in the United States now to suggest that there is no consensus on climate change. Well, that's incorrect. And not only do you need to have the scientific consensus, you need to have a reliable report through scientific journalism or scientific communication. In other words, who is a competent person to report on the scientific consensus? And many politicians in the United States have shown that they are not. So there are layers, of course, of this issue of reliability and expertise. But I think if we guide students through multiple episodes in particular to indicate that when scientists reach a consensus or close to a consensus, that's about the best you can do. And it may not be prudent for us to second guess not only scientific experts, but other experts. That, we divide intellectual labor in our culture so we don't have to do all the work. But that means we have to know who the experts are, and we have to learn to trust them and to step back and let not our ego trump the word of somebody who knows more than we do. And that's a very difficult thing to do. And I think it's one of the reasons in the United States is with its heritage of freedom and liberty, people here don't like to give up their power to believe over to somebody else who knows better than they do. That just runs against them in this American liberty image. Even if they are experts, they say, no, I'm not going to listen to them because I can do everything on my own. And it cautions us as instructors, as science teachers, not to persuade students that they are competent on their own with enough critical thinking to judge the evidence for themselves. That's counterintuitive because we want to promote critical thinking, but we also need to promote deference to expertise. Very difficult balance to play. So yes, there are uncertainties, and no, it's not an easy thing, but we are trying to shepherd all our students to more mature perspectives that acknowledge all these layers and ways of weighing different perspectives.
Thanks, Douglas.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for maybe one or two questions. So I'm gonna read a question on the YouTube chat, and then I'll come back here for a final question, okay? So on the YouTube, we have a comment from Luis Trevisol that says, vaccination is somehow embedded in our culture, I think it's Brazilian culture, due to the large campaigns. However, early treatment was the thing that got us in the popular belief that one can self-medicate based on weak evidence. And we have a question from Sarah Ortman. Professor, do you think we should explore historical or science cases in classroom, even if they don't have an immediate parallel to students' lives or context? Do they have an interest in themselves? And how can we approach modern sciences, very specialized sciences, historical cases?
First, contemporary cases that are unresolved are difficult to use because they are unresolved. But recent history, a decade old, may have already reached a consensus, and we can consider that to be history. And those can be very useful, particularly if they are within the memory of the students, about like, oh, I remember that. Reaching back into history, the historical cases can be valuable for a number of reasons, I think. Some of them are going to be especially relevant to contemporary issues. And we know from experience that students respond to those because they understand that what they are learning in the classroom is relevant. And so they listen, they engage. Other historical cases have lessons that might be ready for applying tomorrow or next week or next year. And we don't want to ignore those. But they may be in a more general view about how science works. Or again, they may talk about the role of science in public health, even if it's not about vaccines. It might be about snake bites and antivenom, for example. Or it might be about learning about the role of scientific consensus, or seeing that scientists can disagree about interpreting the evidence, but over time, with more evidence, they come to some kind of consensus. Those are all important lessons about dealing with science today. The more we go into the world of pure historical scholarship with students who are not yet historians, the more we are likely to lose their attention and actually fail to educate them even about what we hope we are teaching, simply because they do not have the context to make it relevant and, in a sense, to integrate it into everything else that they know. So a spectrum of cases, from those that are highly relevant to here and now, to last month, to next year, to science in general as a background for understanding issues as an adult, I think are all important. And again, I encourage everyone listening to think about how they can fruitfully transform their recent scholarship into a format that would have a much wider audience and would make our work that much more valuable and improve the image of history of science among the general public so that they continue to fund our work.
Okay. Sibeli Marielici, do we have any questions here in the chat?
Oh, yes. We have a question from Lilian Martins.
Okay.
She says, thank you very much for your presentation, Douglas. The historical case study you presented is very elucidative concerning the nature of science. To which level do you think it could be suitable to teach or not? I understand that she's referring to educational level too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
So
Thank you, Lilian.
For those of us who have not spent a lot of time in classrooms and to know how various people respond, although we often have contact with our own family and children and know what they respond to. One of the nice things about these open historical case studies is that you can pose very simple questions and then make them more complicated as the students come to grips with the first levels. And if they get too complicated, then you start cutting things out, removing elements of context, and making it simpler for them. So a strategy for an educator, and that's the expertise of the educators now, is to allow the case study to float up and down to the level of their particular classroom. And again, high school teachers will tell you, this year it's a really bright group, and we raise the bar. And then the next year, like, oh, they're not doing so well, so we pull things back. So even in what you expect to be like the 10th grade level can change. But if we provide enough information and allow the teachers to add or subtract, I think we can leave it to them to sort of negotiate that problem of level with their own students.
Thank you.
Okay, I think it's 4:17, 4 p.m. 17. So we're gonna end this webinar here. Would like to thank Douglas and Marsha for the great talks. Round of applause. And switching the language click. A gente vê todos vocês na próxima segunda-feira, quando vamos ter de novo mais 2 seminários, professor Luiz Carlos Soares, professor Olímpia Lombardi, aqui no Seminários Celebrativos dos 30 anos do GHTC.